Okay, so finally 2 days ago, Resident Evil 4 Remake was finally released, and uh, well, first here it is, my copy. It has a lenticular. I'm not sure if you can see it, but it's kind of hollow. Yeah, you could see it. Nice lenticular uh, covers, and of course there's the basic inside. But yeah, uh, so I thought about making, in celebration of RE4 Remake, I thought about making a video of me bringing those memories, remembering the launch of Gamecube, original RE4 on Gamecube, uh, about, I think, 18 years ago. Yeah, 18 years ago, 2005. Was it? I think it was 2005. So, where do I start? Well, of course, before that, I was, well, I became a huge fan of Resident Evil, of course, from the very first game I bought to my PlayStation 1. But it wasn't the original Resident Evil version, it was the director's cut that was released about a year later in 97. But yeah, uh, that game was immediately, for me, I fell in love with it from the first minutes or something. um, yeah, I've talked about it, that how different it was back then. It felt so different from any other, and it was fucking hard, you know. I was, of course, not, I was not used to the survival horror mechanics of games back then, because there wasn't many. Of course, I had played the original Alone in the Dark, which is a kind of a forefather of Resident Evil, but also a Sweet Home on NES. Uh, so, um, so it was a big thing because, of course, Resident Evil began as a, PlayStation, uh, not PlayStation exclusive, but PlayStation, you know, Resident Evil back in the 90s was, for me, it was, you know, uh, if I could think of some platform that immediately reminds me of Resident Evil, it's PlayStation. Of course, there was Nintendo 64 and Dreamcast supported, and yeah, so it wasn't PlayStation exclusive. But then, the beginning of 2000, early 2000, it was a big surprise that Nintendo, if I have, if I remember right and understand right, they bought the, exclusivity of Resident Evil series. So uh, with GameCube, uh, they would release a remake of the first Resident Evil, and then Resident Evil Zero, and then just port uh, Resident Evil 2 and 3, and Code Veronica. Yeah, that was also released on GameCube, I think. Uh, but those were just ports, uh, unlike first Resident Evil, which had a full remake. And yeah, Resident Evil Zero. But then it was announced that there will also be another Nintendo GameCube exclusive Resident Evil 4. And I remember from my the first time I saw some screenshots uh, on some gaming magazines, because back then, well, I had my first computer with internet connection, I think, in the same year, I think, that Resident Evil 4 was released. I think I had my first internet connection in 2005. But yeah, back then, you know, all the things I was able to see from the games were from gaming magazines, and uh, I was regularly buying a official UK's official PlayStation magazines, which came with playable demo discs. Uh, uh, so I bought those. Of course, uh, uh, Resident Evil 4 being a GameCube game, of course, those were not found in PlayStation magazines, but I think I also wanted to just buy a Nintendo magazine because I wanted to see and read from Resident Evil 4, before it was released. And seeing the first screenshots, I thought, like, okay, this is very different. This is not like old school. It has no pre-rendered backgrounds. The, theme is very different, you could say, from the couple of screenshots. Uh, and I was a little bit on the fence. I was quite skeptic about it initially. I thought, oh, what have they done? They have made maybe too much changes to the game series. But yeah, once the game was released, uh, well, I was still a little bit skeptical, uh, you know, playing the first half an hour. I still wasn't really feeling it. I was not used to the new mechanics and new, the whole new feeling and theme of the game. But the more I played it, the more hours I spent with it, the more I was able to get used to the new mechanics, and I really began to enjoy it, uh, fully enjoy it. Uh, so I remember the first things I just thought about, okay, the action is so fucking enjoyable. It was so blast to just, shoot Canados and other enemies in the game. The gameplay was just, you know, it was just flawless to me. Of course, it still had the tank control, so uh, you still, rotated uh, in place, and it has tank control, so it didn't use the dual stick control theme that uh, many games had already, third person games had already used before, even before Resident Evil 4 game. Uh, but of course, you know, thinking of uh, GameCube controller, the C stick, the Luke stick, so the right stick was so tiny that GameCube controller wasn't made for, FPS, uh, TPS games, third person shooters or first person shooters. It wasn't made for that clearly. So, but that wasn't a problem to me. I think it was actually a good thing that it still had a tank controls because uh, I was so used to the tank controls, of course, because every other Resident Evil before had tank controls. So I was so used to it that it wasn't a problem for me, even though there was so many games that already use it, the dual stick control type. But yeah, and of course the merchant. So a completely new thing that you could buy stuff, buy new weapons, buy ammo, sell, you know, valuables, jewels, and other stuff you collect throughout the game. You could sell those and exchange that for money to be able to buy more things. And also upgrading weapons. That was a big uh, change, and I really loved that. The whole merchant thing and being able to buy new weapons, upgrading them, and selling items. It was really, it works so good, so brilliantly with the games, uh, with the game, and yeah, also of course, some, well, the enemies, the basic enemies. So there wasn't zombies anymore. They were much more intelligent. You could see that they had some brain functions on their head, so they wasn't just mindlessly uh, uh, plunging towards you. So they would, you know, uh, if you um, if you shoot, they would, you know, uh, being able to quickly move to, uh, avoid being shot, and uh, they could also throw stuff at you, hand access and other stuff, like even the dynamites and things like that. So yeah, so that really, you know, that required some time to get used to the whole new uh, mechanics of the game. So yeah, enemies were much more smarter this time. There were a lot more enemies also, comparing to uh, the amount of zombies that would come at you at the same time. There was even more Canados coming at you all around, pretty much all around you. If you think about the first, open area, the village, uh, central village area where there's the church and other buildings, they could come from all around you from all angles. So yeah, surviving was a much harder this time with these new type of enemies than just zombies. Of course, they were not. They were still kind of like walking. Sometimes they run at you. Some Canados at some situations, but they were still pretty much walking. So, uh, but still, I would say walking maybe a little bit faster than zombies. Uh, but yeah, the horror element, of course. So yeah, the horror element was not so strong anymore. Of course, because it has focused much more on action this time. It was like it was action horror. Uh, Still, I could I will say it's survival horror, but to me it's much more action horror than survival horror. But of course, there are in the game, some very memorable, horrifying moments, like, of course, regenerators. The first appear of regenerators in the island area, the last area of the game, in the labs. Those were just frightening enemies, and I just can't wait to see regenerators on Resident Evil 4 Remake. And speaking of that, I still haven't. I think I will start that game tonight, but I have been feeling very tired, you know. Uh, well, you know, late evenings and late nights, I have been feeling very tired, and I don't want to play any games when I'm tired. Uh, and there's no way I will play horror games like Resident Evil or any horror game on daytime. So I will always wait for later, uh, for nights, evenings to start playing. But yeah, I have been feeling very tired. So, uh, but yeah, I will definitely tonight. I will start the game. Uh, so yeah, and of course the big change uh, with the original Resident Evil 4 was back then. Of course, it was much longer game than any other Resident Evil. Okay, maybe Resident Evil Code Veronica was, uh, you know, a little bit closer uh, to how long the game is uh, than any other. Of course, Resident Evil 1, 2, and 3, they were all very short, especially Resident Evil 2, which you could finish in just a couple of hours. But yeah, I remember Resident Evil 4 took me initially, my first playthrough on Gamecube, it took me about 24, yeah, 24 hours. So for a Resident Evil game, it was fucking long. And, you know, I remember my first time playthroughs with Resident Evil 1, 2, and 3, they all took about something like 10 hours or less. First Resident Evil, I think, first playthrough was about 10 hours. Second was about maybe 8 to 9 hours. And Nemesis was something like uh, something like 9 hours. But then, yeah, I remember my first playthrough with Code Veronica. It took me about 20 hours. Uh, yeah, about 20 hours. So it was much closer to Resident Evil 4 as how long the game is. But yeah, those were pretty much my, initial memories of the original Resident Evil 4 uh, that really were the big changes to the game series. And of course, it's a, you know, Resident Evil 4 is a very influential game, you know, thinking of that so many games started to imitate, pretty much copy the same idea and the gameplay of Resident Evil 4. It's a really big milestone in the game industry itself, not just Resident Evil series, but the game industry itself. It's a so big, uh, so hugely influential game. And without Resident Evil 4, I'm pretty sure we wouldn't never had, you know, uh, well, I don't think we would never had the kind of remakes or even remakes at all of Resident Evil 2 and 3 and now 4, like in the style of how they are. They are third person uh, survival horror shooters, uh, like the original Resident Evil 4 was. So without the original RE4, yeah, I think we wouldn't never had the kind of remakes of 2 and 3 and 4 which we have nowadays. Anyway, that's it. And one last look at the changing cover of this game. It really doesn't show that good on my just my camera, phone camera. But anyway, so yeah, I'm wearing my Resident Evil Village shirt. uh, so finally tonight I will start my journey through Resident Evil 4 Remake, and yeah, like I said, there will be quite probably Resident Evil 4 Remake review, but I will take my time. I don't want to rush the game. Uh, so, like I said, I think my review will come in April/May time frame. But anyway, finally, Resident Evil 4 Remake is out and it's phenomenal. Like, reviews are just super positive. Uh, so Capcom, they fucking nailed it. Complete success to Capcom. uh, they did it brilliantly, like they did with the Resident Evil 2 remake. But I think the Resident Evil 3 remake was kind of learning thing for them. They strayed too far, you know. It was almost like reimagining of Resident Evil 3. But I think they learned and they used that learning to make Resident Evil 4 Remake so awesome. Anyway, see you in another video. Bye. What are you buying?